There's a question I ask almost every man over 60 who comes into my office alone. Who else knows how you're really doing? More often than I'd like, the answer is silence. If you're a man living alone after 60, or if someone in your life is, there are things happening in the body and the mind that most people never talk about, not because they're rare, but because they're quiet. They don't announce themselves. They build slowly, in the small decisions of an ordinary day. And here's what surprised me most as I started paying closer attention to this. The biggest risks facing older men who live alone almost never come from loneliness itself. They come from something much smaller and much easier to miss: the habits that quietly shift once no one else is watching. Today, I want to walk you through 5 of them, building from something you'd never expect to matter towards something that, by the end, explains nearly everything that came before it. That last one changed how I talk to my own patients about living alone, and I've saved it for the end on purpose. If any of this sounds familiar to you, your father, or your neighbor down the street, stay with me, because by the end, you'll know exactly what to look for and what to do about it. Let's start with something most people wouldn't expect to matter as much as it does. Number 5 hides in plain sight, and it isn't really about food at all. It's about what happens when there's no one left to cook for. Men living alone tend to eat a narrower range of foods than men who share meals with a partner or family, according to nutrition studies in older adults. Not necessarily less food overall. The calorie count on paper can look perfectly normal, but less variety, fewer vegetables, and more reliance on convenience meals that are easy to prepare and even easier to skip preparing entirely. Here's why that matters more after 60 than it did at 30. Starting somewhere in your 40s or 50s, the body becomes less efficient at building and maintaining muscle from the protein you eat. Doctors sometimes call this anabolic resistance. In plain terms, it means your muscles don't respond to protein as efficiently as they once did, like a door that used to swing open with a light push and now needs a firmer shove. If the meals aren't there to push against, muscle quietly erodes in the background, even without dramatic weight loss on the scale. Consider a man like Walter, 74, a retired electrician living alone in a small house outside Columbus. His wife had always managed the cooking. After she passed, his meals shrank down to cereal, toast, and the occasional frozen dinner, not because he couldn't cook, but because cooking for one felt pointless. 18 months later, his doctor noticed something on a routine visit. His grip strength had dropped, and standing up from a chair took visibly more effort than it used to. Nothing about his weight had raised alarms. It was the quiet loss of muscles that had gone unnoticed. This is the part people miss. Sarcopenia, the medical term for age-related muscle loss, doesn't usually show up as weight loss. In fact, the scale can look completely unremarkable while strength quietly declines underneath it. It shows up, instead, as difficulty opening jars, climbing stairs, or getting up off the floor after gardening. And once it progresses, it's among the strongest predictors doctors watch for when someone starts losing independence. The fix isn't complicated, and it doesn't require becoming a chef. Protein at every meal: eggs, yogurt, canned fish, beans, a rotisserie chicken that lasts 3 days makes a measurable difference. So does simply not skipping meals, because eating alone feels like a chore rather than something worth doing well. But meals aren't the only routine that quietly comes apart when a house goes from 2 people to 1. The same thing happens after dark. Number 4 is sleep, and here's the part that surprises most people. The changes usually have less to do with age than with structure. When you live with someone else, your days have built-in rhythm: shared meal times, someone else's schedule pulling you out of bed, conversation in the evening that naturally winds down before sleep. Take that structure away, and sleep patterns tend to drift. Bedtimes creep later, naps creep longer. The television becomes the last thing seen before sleep instead of a book or conversation. Sleep researchers have consistently linked irregular sleep timing, not just poor sleep quality, but inconsistent timing, to worse cognitive performance and mood in older adults. Your circadian rhythm, the internal clock that tells your body when to feel alert and when to wind down, relies heavily on consistent cues. Light exposure, meal timing, activity, and social contact. Remove several of those cues at once, and the clock starts running loose. Think of someone like Frank, 68, a retired shift supervisor living alone in Tucson. Without his wife's routine to anchor him, his bedtime drifted from 10 p.m. to well past midnight, and he began sleeping stretches broken up by long afternoon afternoon naps. He assumed this was simply how sleep works when you're older. What was actually happening was that his sleep had lost its rhythm, and that loss was making him foggier, more irritable, and less motivated to stay active during the day, which in turn made his sleep even less regular. The practical fix here isn't complicated, but it does need intention. Getting outside for morning light within the first hour or so of waking helps reset that internal clock. So does keeping a consistent wake time, even on days with nothing scheduled. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but morning light combined with a small amount of movement, even a short walk, has been shown to help stabilize the sleep-wake cycle far more effectively than either one alone. If any of that sounds like a routine you've slipped into without quite noticing, subscribe now, because what comes next goes past comfort and into how being alone can change the body itself, not just the mood. Number 3 is where the science gets harder to dismiss as just emotional. This one is about the physical toll of social isolation. This is one of the most studied and most consistently confirmed findings in the research on aging. Large observational studies, along with reviews from major public health and aging research bodies, have associated chronic social isolation in older adults with higher risks for cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, and earlier mortality. Some researchers have compared the magnitude of that risk to other well-known health hazards. The comparison itself has been debated, but the underlying pattern that isolation correlates with worse physical health outcomes, not just worse mood, has held up across many independent studies. Here's the mechanism. In plain language, chronic loneliness appears to keep the body's stress response mildly activated for long stretches, slightly elevated stress hormones, slightly higher inflammation, a nervous system that doesn't fully downshift into rest. Nothing dramatic on any single day, but sustained over months and years. That low simmer has been linked to real wear on the cardiovascular system and the brain. And here's the part that matters most for men specifically. Research on social patterns has repeatedly found that men are, on average, more likely than women to rely on a spouse as their primary, sometimes only source of close emotional connection. When that spouse is gone, whether through death, divorce, or distance, many men find they don't have a backup social network already in place. Women, on average, tend to maintain broader friendships throughout life. It's not true of every man, but it's common enough that many don't build that same web until they suddenly need it. Picture someone like Raymond, 71, a retired machinist in rural Michigan. For 40 years, his wife had been the one who called their children, planned visits with old friends, and kept the social calendar running on the kitchen wall by the phone. After she died, Raymond realized he genuinely didn't know how to reach out to people the way she always had. He'd never had to learn. Weeks would pass without a real conversation. He wasn't depressed in any way he could point to. He simply had no practiced habit of connection, because for 4 decades, someone else had been doing it for him. The action here isn't about forcing yourself into a crowded room. Research on loneliness suggests that the quality of contact matters more than the quantity. One meaningful conversation a day appears to do more for the body's stress response than a room full of small talk. A regular phone call, a weekly coffee, a standing lunch with even one person can meaningfully shift this pattern, and it connects directly back to muscle and sleep. Men with even modest social contact tend to move more, eat more regular meals, and keep more consistent schedules because someone else is, in a sense, keeping them accountable to the day. But there's a version of this risk that has nothing to do with how a man feels, and everything to do with what nobody else is there to see. Number 2. Living alone can delay the recognition of a medical problem, sometimes by weeks. This is one of the quieter dangers, and it's almost entirely structural rather than medical. When you live with someone else, they notice things about you that you don't notice about yourself. The slight slur after a small stroke, the unusual confusion after a medication interaction, the persistent cough that's gone on 3 weeks too long, the weight loss that's obvious to someone who sees you daily but invisible in the mirror. Studies on stroke recognition and treatment delay have found that people who live alone are diagnosed later and treated later than people who live with others, largely because there's no one present to notice the early warning signs or to insist on a call to the doctor. The same pattern shows up with falls. Research has found that older adults living alone who fall are more likely to remain on the floor for an extended period before getting help, which itself is associated with worse outcomes Independent of the injury from the fall, consider someone like Arthur, 79, a widower living alone in a two-story home outside Sacramento. He'd had a minor fall in the bathroom, nothing broken, but enough to leave him briefly unable to get up. He was on the cold tile for close to 2 hours before he managed to hook a towel with his fingertips and pull himself toward the phone. Nothing about that fall was unusual. What made it dangerous was that no one else was there to notice he hadn't answered his usual morning call. This is not a reason for fear, it's a reason for a plan. A simple check-in system, a daily call or text with a family member or friend, a medical alert device, or even something as low-tech as a shared calendar where you mark each day can significantly reduce that gap. The goal isn't surveillance, it's making sure that if something does happen, the delay is measured in minutes, not hours. Everything so far, the meals, the sleep, the isolation, the delayed help has a common root. And once you see it, you start to understand why some men living alone struggle with all of it, while others, with the same circumstances, don't. Number one isn't really a fact about living alone at all. It's about what living alone can quietly take away first, a sense of purpose. Here's what the research keeps circling back to. Across studies on retirement, bereavement, and aging, one factor shows up again and again as protective against several of the risks we've discussed today: muscle loss, poor sleep, isolation, delayed medical care. That factor is having a defined reason to get up in the morning. Researchers sometimes call it purpose in life, and it's been measured, studied, and linked in long-term observational research to lower rates of cognitive decline, better cardiovascular outcomes, and greater resilience after major life changes like losing a spouse. Here's the plain language version of why this matters so much. When a man has a reason to be somewhere, a grandchild to pick up, a volunteer shift, a standing appointment with a friend, everything else tends to fall into place around it. He eats before he goes. He sleeps so he's rested for it. He gets dressed, which sounds small until you consider how many small protective behaviors are bundled inside the simple act of having somewhere to be. Take it away, and there's no scaffolding left. Meals become optional. Sleep drifts. Days blur into each other. It's not that the man stops caring about his health, it's that the structure that used to carry those healthy habits automatically is gone, and nothing has replaced it yet. Think about someone like Donald, 76, a retired high school teacher in Portland who lost his wife 3 years ago. For the first year, his days had no real shape. He'd wake up without knowing why he was waking up, eat when he happened to notice he was hungry, and go to bed whenever the television ran out of things to hold his attention. He described it to me almost exactly the way I'm describing it to you now, not sadness exactly, just drift. What changed things wasn't a dramatic intervention. It was volunteering 2 mornings a week at a local library, reading to children in an after-school program. Within months, his sleep had regularized because he had to be up and dressed by a certain hour. His meals had structure again because he was preparing to be somewhere instead of just filling time. He'd even started walking the mile there instead of driving, just because he liked the morning air. Nothing about his biology changed overnight. What changed was that he had a reason to organize his day around something outside himself, and every other habit we've talked about today reorganized itself around that purpose, without him having to force any of it individually. This is why I saved this one for last. Every point before this, the protein, the morning light, the phone calls, the check-in system works best when it's anchored to something with meaning. A man who volunteers at a food bank 2 mornings a week isn't just filling time. He's building in movement, social contact, structure, and a reason to take care of himself all at once, without having to think about any of it as health advice. So if you take one thing from everything we've covered today, let it be this. None of it is really a checklist of 5 separate problems. It's one problem wearing 5 different faces, the quiet disappearance of the ordinary architecture that used to hold a day together, a reason to eat well, a reason to sleep on schedule, a reason to talk to someone, a reason to be noticed if something goes wrong. None of that has to vanish just because a house got quieter. If you're the man living alone, you don't need to overhaul your life this week. Pick one thing: a standing lunch with an old friend, a volunteer shift, a daily call with your kids, and build it in. If you're the son, daughter, or friend of a man living alone, the single most protective thing you can offer isn't advice. It's regularity: a call at the same time each week, a visit on the calendar, something he can count on. And if you have a medical condition or take medication, talk with your healthcare professional before making any significant changes to diet, activity, or routine. What we've covered today is meant to inform that conversation, not replace it. The truth is, living alone doesn't have to mean living without structure, without connection, or without purpose. Those things don't require another person in the house. They require intention, and it's never too late to build them back in. Tell me in the comments, which of these 5 surprised you the most, or which one sounds like someone you know?